In the summer of 2019, in a quiet suburb outside Birmingham, Alabama, a UPS driver noticed something that would unravel one of the most disturbing family secrets in American history. He'd been delivering packages to the Hargrove estate for 3 years, a sprawling property with multiple buildings connected by covered walkways. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, he saw a face in the window of the back house, a woman's face, pale and terrified, pressing against the glass. And then, just as quickly, she disappeared. The curtain snapped shut, and that driver, a man named Derek Chen, couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. What authorities discovered 6 weeks later, after multiple welfare checks and finally a warrant to enter the property, was something that seasoned investigators said gave them nightmares. Months afterward, inside the Hargrove compound were 7 women, ranging in age from 19 to 43, who had been living in secret for decades. These weren't kidnapping victims in the traditional sense. They were family members, sisters, cousins, nieces. Each one had been claimed by a Hargrove son as a secret bride, hidden from the outside world, trapped in marriages that were both illegal and unthinkable. And the genetic evidence that came later, the DNA tests that proved what had been happening for 2 generations, that evidence made scientists question how something this systematically evil could happen in modern America. Before we go any deeper into this nightmare, I need you to do something. I need you to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because what I'm about to reveal comes from sealed court documents, medical records that were almost never made public, and testimony from survivors who risked everything to tell their stories. This isn't clickbait. This isn't exaggeration. This is documented evidence of how 7 men in one family created a secret world of abuse, manipulation, and genetic catastrophe that authorities in Jefferson County, Alabama, are still trying to fully understand. So stay with me, because the Hargrove case goes places darker than you can imagine. The Hargrove family had deep roots in Alabama, going back to the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. They'd made their money in timber and later in real estate development. By the 1970s, they owned over 2,000 acres outside Birmingham, property that included the main family mansion, several outbuildings, and enough land to ensure complete privacy from neighbors. The patriarch, William Hargrove Sr., was known in the community as a successful businessman, a deacon at the local Baptist church, and a generous donor to conservative political causes. Nobody suspected that behind the gates of his estate, he was implementing a family structure that would destroy lives for the next 50 years. William Sr. had 7 sons and 4 daughters. And according to testimony that emerged during the trials, he began indoctrinating his children from a very young age with a twisted ideology about bloodline purity and family loyalty. He taught them that the Hargrove blood was special, that mixing with outsiders would dilute their strength and intelligence, that the family's success depended on keeping their genetics concentrated. He used religious language, claiming that God had chosen the Hargrove line for a special purpose, and that intermarriage within the family was not just acceptable, but divinely mandated. This wasn't ignorance or lack of education. William Sr. had a business degree from Auburn University. He knew exactly what he was preaching, and he knew it was wrong by every legal and moral standard. But he built an entire belief system to justify it anyway. The pattern started in 1981 when the eldest son, William Jr., turned 23. His father arranged for him to marry his 16-year-old sister, Catherine, in a secret ceremony performed by a family friend who had been excommunicated from his church for previous ethical violations. There was no legal marriage certificate. The wedding happened in the basement of the main house with only family members present, and from that day forward, Catherine disappeared from public life. She was withdrawn from high school. Her friends were told she'd moved away to attend a private academy. In reality, she was moved into one of the back buildings on the property, where she would spend the next 38 years as a hidden wife and mother to children, who were both her nephews and her sons, both her nieces and her daughters. This same pattern repeated with each Hargrove son as he came of age. The second son, Robert, was married to his first cousin, a girl named Mary who had been raised on the property after her parents died in a car accident. The third son, James, was given his younger sister, Elizabeth, when he turned 25 and she turned 17. The fourth son, Michael, married another cousin who had been living with the family. And so it continued, each son receiving a secret bride from within the family bloodline, each woman effectively erased from the outside world, hidden away in the sprawling compound where no one could hear them scream. Now, you might be wondering how something like this could happen in America in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s. How could women just disappear without anyone noticing? The answer is disturbing in its simplicity. The Hargrove family was wealthy, respected, and isolated. The women who became secret brides were already within the family system, already under the control of the patriarch. Many had been homeschooled, given minimal education, and raised with the same twisted religious ideology that justified what was being done to them. They had no social security numbers in some cases, no driver's licenses, no bank accounts, no connections to the outside world. They existed in a legal and social gray zone where they were simultaneously visible to family members and completely invisible to society. The property layout facilitated this secrecy. The main mansion, where William Sr. and his wife lived along with the unmarried daughters, faced the road and maintained an appearance of normalcy. But behind it, connected by covered walkways and hidden by dense trees, were 7 separate buildings. Each one housed a Hargrove son and his secret bride. The buildings had been renovated in the 1980s with soundproofing, reinforced locks on the doors, and minimal windows. From the outside, they looked like guest cottages or farm buildings. Inside, they were prisons disguised as homes. Catherine Hargrove, the first secret bride, later testified that she knew what was happening was wrong from the very beginning. But she had no power, no resources, and nowhere to go. Her husband controlled every aspect of her life. She wasn't allowed to leave the building without permission. She had no phone, no internet, no way to contact the outside world. When she gave birth to her first child in 1983, a home birth attended only by her mother and sisters, the baby wasn't registered with the state. No birth certificate, no social security number, nothing. That child, a girl named Sarah, would grow up entirely off the grid, her existence unknown to authorities, her childhood spent in a 20 by 30-foot building with her mother and eventually 3 younger siblings. The genetic consequences of this systematic inbreeding were catastrophic and became more severe with each generation. The first children born to these secret marriages had elevated rates of health problems, learning disabilities, and physical abnormalities, but some were relatively healthy. However, as these children grew up, and as the inbreeding continued into a second generation, the genetic damage compounded exponentially. By 2019, when authorities finally entered the compound, they found children and young adults with severe cognitive impairments, physical deformities, immune system disorders, and neurological conditions that left some completely dependent on their mothers for basic care. Medical examinations after the rescue revealed the full scope of the genetic nightmare. Of the 43 individuals found living in the secret buildings, over 30 had significant health issues directly attributable to inbreeding. There were cases of microcephaly, where children were born with abnormally small heads and brains. There were skeletal abnormalities, kids whose bones hadn't developed properly, leaving them unable to walk without assistance. There were multiple cases of early onset blindness caused by recessive genetic conditions. And there were psychiatric problems, children and adults who exhibited symptoms consistent with inbreeding depression, including severe anxiety, depression, and in some cases, psychotic episodes that no medication could fully control. Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the geneticist from the University of Alabama, who analyzed DNA samples from the Hargrove family, said in her testimony that she'd never seen anything like it outside of laboratory animal colonies. The genetic homozygosity levels were extreme. Some individuals had inherited identical copies of over 35% of their genome, meaning more than a third of their genetic material was doubled up, with no diversity between the maternal and paternal copies. For comparison, even children of first cousin marriages typically show homozygosity levels of only 6 to 8%. The Hargrove family had compressed their genetics so severely over 2 generations that some family members were as genetically similar to each other as identical twins are to their parents. But the genetic horror was only part of the story. The psychological abuse, the systematic control, the way these women and children had been isolated and manipulated, that created damage that DNA tests couldn't measure. Catherine Hargrove described decades of being told that the outside world was evil, that if she ever left the compound, she would be killed or imprisoned. She was told that her children would be taken away and hurt if she ever tried to escape. She watched her daughters grow up in the same building where she'd been imprisoned, knowing that when they reached adolescence, they would likely face the same fate she had. And she felt powerless to stop it, because William Sr. had created a system where everyone was both victim and enforcer, where family members policed each other, where any hint of rebellion was crushed through isolation, threats, or violence. The break in the case came because of Derek Chen, that UPS driver who saw a face in the window. He reported what he'd seen to local police, but the first welfare check found nothing suspicious. The Hargroves were prepared for occasional scrutiny. They'd been handling deliveries, utility workers, and the rare visitor for decades without arousing suspicion. William Sr. came to the door, charming and cooperative, explained that the back buildings were used by adult children who valued their privacy, and assured officers that everyone on the property was there voluntarily. The police left and Derek Chen was told there was no evidence of any problem. But Chen couldn't let it go. The fear he'd seen in that woman's face haunted him. He started documenting everything. He took photos of the property layout. He noted patterns in the deliveries, how certain buildings never seemed to have anyone coming or going, how supplies were always brought in rather than residents leaving to shop. He contacted a local investigative journalist named Rebecca Thornton, who specialized in stories about isolated religious communities and family abuse. And together, they started building a case that something deeply wrong was happening behind the gates of the Hargrove estate. Thornton's investigation took months. She interviewed former employees who had worked for the Hargrove family, groundskeepers and maintenance workers who had seen things they couldn't explain. One man described delivering food supplies to the back buildings and hearing children's voices inside, but never seeing any children outside playing. Another described being told to soundproof one of the buildings in 1995, and wondering why a guest cottage would need that level of sound insulation. A woman who had briefly worked as a cleaner in the main house described seeing young girls who seemed terrified, who wouldn't make eye contact, who flinched when adults approached them. Individually, these observations seemed odd, but not necessarily criminal. Together, they painted a picture of a family hiding something terrible. The turning point came when Thornton tracked down a former Hargrove family member, a woman named Grace, who was William Sr.'s niece, and who had escaped the compound in 2003. Grace had been marked as a potential bride for one of the younger Hargrove sons, but she'd managed to run away at age 17 before the marriage could be arranged. She'd spent the last 16 years rebuilding her life, but she'd never spoken publicly about what she'd witnessed growing up on the Hargrove property. Thornton convinced her that speaking out might save others, and in July 2019, Grace gave a video interview describing the secret marriages, the hidden women, the children being born and raised off the grid. That interview, combined with Derek Chen's documentation and the testimony of former employees, was enough to convince a judge to issue a search warrant. On August 13, 2019, Jefferson County Sheriff's deputies, accompanied by FBI agents and Child Protective Services workers, entered the Hargrove compound with a warrant to search for evidence of human trafficking, child abuse, and false imprisonment. What they found exceeded their worst expectations. In 7 separate buildings, they discovered 7 women and 36 children and young adults, many of whom had never left the property in their entire lives. The women ranged from a 19-year-old who had been married to her uncle just 6 months earlier to Catherine Hargrove, 63 years old, and a secret bride for 38 years. Some of the children had never been more than 50 feet from the building where they were born. The scene that officers described was surreal. The buildings were clean and relatively well maintained, furnished like small apartments, but with reinforced locks on the outside of the doors. The women weren't chained or physically restrained, but they were psychologically imprisoned, so thoroughly indoctrinated and terrified that even when officers told them they were being rescued, many begged to stay, claimed they were happy, insisted that nothing wrong was happening. It took hours of patient work by trained psychologists to begin breaking through the layers of manipulation and fear that had been built up over decades. The children presented even more complex challenges. Many had never been to a doctor, never been vaccinated, never received any education beyond what their mothers could provide in isolation. Some of the older children had severe, untreated medical conditions. One 16-year-old boy was blind from cataracts that could have been easily treated if he'd had access to health care. A 12-year-old girl had a cleft palate that had never been surgically repaired, leaving her unable to speak clearly. Multiple children showed signs of malnutrition despite the family's wealth, not because food was scarce, but because their mothers, isolated and under constant stress, hadn't been able to provide adequate nutrition while dealing with their own trauma and the demands of caring for multiple special needs children with no support. The 7 Hargrove sons were arrested at the scene and charged with an array of crimes including incest, child abuse, false imprisonment, and conspiracy to commit human trafficking. William Hargrove Sr., 87 years old and suffering from dementia, was deemed incompetent to stand trial, but was placed in a secure medical facility. The Hargrove daughters, who had remained in the main house and had participated in maintaining the system of secrecy, were also arrested and charged as accessories to the crimes. The legal proceedings would take over 3 years to fully resolve, with multiple trials, plea deals, and sentencing hearings that exposed every horrific detail of what had been happening on that property since 1981. The genetic testing performed on all family members provided scientific confirmation of what everyone suspected. DNA analysis proved that every child born in those secret buildings was the product of incestuous relationships. Many were the children of uncle, niece pairings, or brother-sister marriages. But even more disturbing was the evidence of second-generation inbreeding. Some of the youngest children found on the property were the offspring of first-generation inbred parents. Their genetic profiles showed the catastrophic effects of compounded inbreeding, with homozygosity levels approaching 40%, genetic damage so severe that medical experts testified they'd never seen anything comparable in living human populations. Dr. Martinez's genetic analysis became a key piece of evidence in the prosecution, She testified that the pattern of inbreeding was clearly intentional and systematic, not the result of ignorance or accident. The Hargrove men had deliberately selected wives from within their immediate family, had deliberately isolated them to prevent any genetic diversity from entering the line, and had deliberately continued this pattern into a second generation, despite obvious evidence that children were being born with severe disabilities. This wasn't a case of an isolated community stumbling into inbreeding through limited options. This was calculated, ideological, and sustained over nearly 40 years. The psychological evaluations of the secret brides revealed layers of trauma that would take years of therapy to address. These women had been groomed from childhood to accept their fate, told that serving as secret wives was their religious duty and family obligation. They'd been isolated during the most formative years of their lives, deprived of education, social connections, and any opportunity to develop independence. Many exhibited symptoms consistent with Stockholm Syndrome, having developed emotional attachments to their captors as a survival mechanism. Some still defended their husbands during the trials, claimed they'd been happy, insisted that outsiders didn't understand their way of life. These testimonies were heartbreaking because they revealed just how completely the indoctrination had worked. Catherine Hargrove, the first secret bride, became a key witness for the prosecution once she'd undergone months of therapy and begun to understand the full scope of what had been done to her. Her testimony was devastating. She described being told at age 16 that God had chosen her to be her brother's wife, that this was a great honor and responsibility. She described the wedding ceremony in the basement, performed by a defrocked minister who told her that spiritual marriage transcended man's laws. She described being moved into the back building and realizing, slowly over months and years, that she was a prisoner. She described giving birth to 4 children, watching them grow up without education, without health care, without any hope of a normal life. And she described the moment, decades later, when her own daughter turned 16, and Catherine realized with horror that her daughter would be next, that the cycle would continue unless someone stopped it. But Catherine also described something that prosecutors found particularly chilling. She explained how the Hargrove men rotated between the buildings, how they had created a schedule so each man could visit other secret brides, producing children with multiple family members to further concentrate the genetics. This wasn't just 7 separate cases of incestuous marriage. This was a coordinated breeding program designed to create the most genetically homogeneous family possible. The Hargrove men shared detailed records of bloodlines, tracked genetic traits they considered desirable, and deliberately planned pregnancies to maximize what they called purity, but what geneticists recognized as a recipe for genetic catastrophe. The trials revealed that this ideology hadn't originated with William Sr. alone. He'd been influenced by fringe religious texts and pseudo-scientific theories about bloodline purity that circulated in certain extremist communities in the American South during the 1960s and 70s. These materials, which mixed distorted Christianity with eugenic ideas and conspiracy theories about societal decline, convinced him that wealthy, white, Christian families had a duty to preserve their genetic heritage by any means necessary. He'd created a self-contained world where these ideas could be implemented without external interference, where he could play God with his own family's genetics, and where anyone who questioned him could be controlled through manipulation, isolation, or force. Similar cases, though rarely as extreme or long-lasting as the Hargrove situation, have emerged periodically across the United States and globally. In rural Missouri, authorities discovered a family in 2007 where 3 generations of father-daughter incest had produced over a dozen children with severe disabilities. In the mountains of Kentucky, The Whitaker family became infamous when a photographer documented their lives, revealing the devastating effects of generations of inbreeding in an isolated community. In Austria, the Joseph Fritzl case shocked the world when it was revealed he'd imprisoned his daughter for 24 years and fathered 7 children with her, creating a genetic nightmare in a hidden basement. In remote areas of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, where first cousin marriage is culturally accepted and has been practiced for many generations, geneticists have documented communities where specific recessive genetic disorders occur at rates hundreds of times higher than in outbred populations. Hargrove case stands out because of its scale, its duration, and the level of systematic planning involved. This wasn't one predator creating one victim. This was 7 men, enabled by their parents and siblings, creating a multi-generational system of abuse that produced 43 victims. And it happened not in some remote, impoverished area, but in suburban Alabama, within an hour's drive of a major American city, on property that was regularly visited by delivery drivers, utility workers, and others who could have noticed something wrong if they'd been more observant, or if they'd taken initial concerns more seriously. The Child Protective Service's response to the Hargrove case was massive and unprecedented. 43 individuals needed immediate medical care, psychological evaluation, and placement in appropriate facilities. The youngest victims, children under 12 who had never experienced life outside the compound, needed intensive therapy just to understand that the world wasn't the terrifying place they'd been told it was. Teenagers faced the challenge of catching up on years of missed education while dealing with the trauma of their upbringing. Young adults in their 20s and 30s, some of whom had children of their own, needed to learn basic life skills like using money, driving a car, or interacting with strangers, skills most people take for granted. The medical costs alone ran into millions of dollars. Many victims needed corrective surgeries for conditions that should have been treated in childhood. Others required ongoing treatment for genetic disorders that would affect them for life. The psychiatric care needed to address trauma, anxiety, depression, and learned helplessness was extensive and would continue for years. And beyond the immediate crisis response, there were long-term needs for education, job training, housing assistance, and social services to help these individuals build independent lives after decades of captivity. The 7 Hargrove sons were all convicted on multiple counts. Sentences ranged from 25 years to life in prison, without possibility of parole. William Jr., the eldest son and first secret husband, received the harshest sentence, life without parole, due to his role in perpetuating the system and his crimes against both his sister, wife, and his own daughter. The trials revealed that he had been grooming his daughter for marriage to one of his brothers, continuing the cycle into a 3rd generation before authorities intervened. The testimony about his actions, the deliberate psychological manipulation of children, the planning of future incestuous marriages, convinced the jury that he represented an ongoing danger who should never be released. The question of culpability for the secret brides themselves was complex and controversial. Were they victims or accomplices? They had helped maintain the system, raised children within it, and in some cases had actively participated in indoctrinating younger family members into accepting the ideology. But they had also been groomed from childhood, married against their will as minors, and held captive through psychological manipulation and physical isolation. Ultimately, prosecutors decided not to charge any of the women, classifying them as victims rather than perpetrators. This decision angered some advocates who felt that adult women had a responsibility to protect children, even in difficult circumstances. But mental health professionals who evaluated the women testified that their capacity for independent judgment had been so thoroughly undermined by decades of abuse that holding them criminally responsible would be unjust. The property itself, the Hargrove estate, was seized by the state through civil forfeiture. The proceeds from its eventual sale went into a victims' compensation fund to help pay for the ongoing medical and psychological care that survivors would need. The buildings where the secret brides had been kept were demolished. No one wanted to preserve structures that had been prisons for so many people for so many years. The main mansion, after being stripped of the family's belongings, was sold to a developer who converted it into professional office space, erasing the last physical traces of the Hargrove family's presence. The broader community of Birmingham and Jefferson County struggled to understand how this had happened in their midst. There was soul searching about warning signs that were missed, about a wealthy family being given privacy and deference that allowed evil to flourish unchecked. Local churches examined their own teachings about family, authority, and submission, recognizing that certain interpretations of biblical texts about family hierarchy had been twisted to justify abuse. Schools and medical facilities reviewed their policies about tracking children, recognizing that homeschooling regulations and religious exemptions from medical care had created loopholes that predators could exploit. The case also sparked national conversations about the limits of religious freedom and parental rights. The Hargrove defense attorneys had tried to argue that the family was simply practicing their religious beliefs, that the state had no right to interfere in private family matters. These arguments were ultimately rejected by courts at every level, but they highlighted tensions in American law between protecting individual liberty and preventing abuse. How much can the government intervene in families? At what point does respecting religious diversity enable harm? These questions have no easy answers, but the Hargrove case provided a clear example of where the line should be drawn. When adults are imprisoned, when children are denied education and medical care, when systematic abuse is occurring, the state has both a right and an obligation to intervene regardless of religious justifications. The survivors of the Hargrove compound faced long and difficult roads to recovery. Catherine Hargrove, at 63 years old when rescued, had spent more of her life as a captive than as a free person. She struggled with survivor's guilt, with anger at the years that had been stolen from her, with the challenge of building a new identity after decades of having no autonomy. But she also became an advocate for other survivors of family abuse, sharing her story to help people understand how manipulation and isolation can trap people in situations that from the outside seem obviously escapable. Her message was simple but powerful. Don't judge victims for not leaving. You don't know what psychological chains they're bound by until you've experienced that kind of systematic control yourself. Some of the children and young adults adapted relatively well to life outside the compound. The younger ones, with more time ahead of them and with intensive support, showed remarkable resilience. They learned, they made friends, they discovered talents and interests they'd never been allowed to explore during their captivity. But others struggled profoundly. Some of the adults with severe disabilities from inbreeding required permanent supportive care. Some of those without significant disabilities still found the outside world overwhelming and frightening, despite years of therapy. A few attempted to return to the only life they'd known, seeking out isolated religious communities that reminded them of the structure and certainty they'd grown up with, even though that structure had been abusive. The genetic legacy of the Hargrove case will persist for generations. The survivors carry genetic markers for numerous recessive disorders. Any children they have with unrelated partners will be carriers for these conditions. Genetic counseling for Hargrove descendants is complex and requires careful management to help them understand their risks without stigmatizing them for circumstances beyond their control. Medical researchers continue to study anonymized genetic data from the family looking for insights into human genetic diversity, the effects of inbreeding, and potential treatments for the rare disorders that were concentrated in the Hargrove genome. Dr. Martinez published several papers on the Hargrove genetics, carefully anonymized to protect survivors' privacy. Her work has been cited in discussions about minimum viable population sizes for human space colonization, about genetic diversity requirements for isolated communities, and about the medical ethics of genetic screening. The Hargrove case became a teaching example in genetics courses, law schools, and social work programs, a case study in how biology, psychology, law, and ethics intersect when families become closed systems of abuse. The journalist Rebecca Thornton, who helped break the case, won multiple awards for her investigative reporting, but she also described the psychological toll of immersing herself in such dark material for months. She suffered nightmares and intrusive thoughts. She second-guessed every decision, wondering if she could have moved faster, saved the victims sooner. Other journalists who covered the trials reported similar struggles. There's a cost to bearing witness to this kind of evil, even for professional observers who aren't directly harmed. The Hargrove case was a reminder that trauma ripples outward, affecting not just immediate victims but everyone who encounters the aftermath. Grace, the niece who escaped and whose testimony helped crack the case, struggled with her own complex feelings. She felt relief that others had been saved. She felt vindicated that people finally believed what she'd been saying. But she also felt guilt that she hadn't come forward sooner, even though she'd been a traumatized teenager when she escaped and had spent years just trying to survive and build a normal life. Therapists assured her that she wasn't responsible for crimes committed by adults, that she'd done the brave thing by eventually speaking out. But survivors' guilt isn't rational. It took years of therapy for Grace to accept that she'd done the best she could with the resources and understanding she had at the time. Derek Chen, the UPS driver whose observation started the investigation, also grappled with the weight of what he'd helped uncover. He was hailed as a hero by some, but he saw himself as someone who'd simply paid attention and cared enough to act. In interviews after the case concluded, he emphasized that anyone could do what he did. The key was believing victims, taking concerns seriously even when they seemed unlikely, and being persistent when initial investigations didn't find anything. His message resonated with advocacy groups working on human trafficking and family abuse issues. Most victims aren't rescued through dramatic interventions. They're rescued because ordinary people notice something wrong and refuse to ignore it. The Hargrove case also exposed gaps in America's systems for tracking and protecting children. Homeschooling, when done responsibly, can provide excellent education tailored to individual children's needs, but it can also be used to hide abuse and educational neglect. The Hargrove children had technically been homeschooled, but with no oversight, no standardized testing, no welfare checks. Multiple states reviewed their homeschooling regulations after the case, implementing new requirements for periodic evaluations and health screenings. These changes faced opposition from homeschooling advocacy groups who feared government overreach, but most states found compromises that increased accountability while respecting parental choice for families using homeschooling legitimately. Similarly, the case highlighted issues with birth registration and Social Security requirements. Some of the Hargrove children had been born without any official documentation, making them essentially invisible to government systems. This isn't unique to abuse situations. There are thousands of Americans without proper birth certificates or identification due to home births, religious objections to government documentation, or simple administrative failures. But the Hargrove case showed how this invisibility can enable abuse. Policymakers debated how to balance privacy concerns with the need to ensure every child has some connection to protective systems. The religious dimensions of the case sparked particularly intense debates. The Hargroves had claimed Christian faith as justification for their actions, citing biblical passages about family authority and bloodline purity. Mainstream Christian denominations were quick to denounce these interpretations as heretical distortions that bore no relationship to authentic Christian teaching. But scholars of religion pointed out that any belief system can be twisted to justify harm when taken to extremes and practiced in isolation from broader community accountability. The problem wasn't Christianity per se, but rather the toxic combination of isolation, authoritarian control, and selective interpretation of texts to serve predetermined conclusions. Mental health professionals who worked with Hargrove survivors noted common patterns with other cases of long-term family abuse. Victims often showed symptoms consistent with complex PTSD, a condition resulting from prolonged trauma in captivity. They struggled with emotional regulation, had difficulty trusting others, experienced intrusive memories and flashbacks, and had distorted self-concepts shaped by years of being told they were worthless except as breeding stock. Treatment required specialized approaches designed for trauma survivors, with particular attention to helping victims understand that what happened to them wasn't their fault and didn't define their worth as human beings. One of the most challenging aspects of recovery for many survivors was reconciling their feelings about family. These people had been terribly harmed by family members, but family was also all they'd known. Some of the women still loved their husbands despite recognizing that the relationships had been abusive and wrong. Some of the children still wanted contact with their fathers despite understanding what those fathers had done. Therapists had to navigate these complicated emotions, helping survivors process their experiences without telling them how they should feel. There's no right way to feel about family members who are both abusers and the only family you've ever known. The Hargrove case continues to resonate years after the initial rescue. Survivors are still rebuilding their lives, still processing trauma, still learning to navigate a world that was intentionally hidden from them. The youngest victims, children who were toddlers when rescued, have the best chance at normal lives, but they'll always carry the biological legacy of their origins. The genetic conditions, the family history, the trauma passed down through generations. These things don't disappear just because the immediate danger has ended. What the Hargrove case ultimately reveals is that monsters aren't always strangers lurking in dark alleys. Sometimes they're respected businessmen, churchgoers, people who seem normal from the outside. Sometimes evil wears a suit and speaks politely and hides behind gates and respectability. And sometimes the worst crimes aren't committed in moments of passion or desperation, but are planned methodically over decades, justified with elaborate ideologies, and perpetuated through systematic control that breaks down victims' capacity to resist or even recognize they're being harmed. Story of the Hargrove family is a nightmare that happened in broad daylight in modern America, within sight of thousands of people who never quite saw what was hiding behind the facade of normalcy. It's a reminder that we need to look beyond surfaces, trust our instincts when something feels wrong, and be willing to take action even when it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. Because somewhere right now, there's probably another compound, another family, another group of victims waiting for someone to notice, someone to care, someone to be brave enough to look behind the curtain and expose the evil hiding there. The question isn't whether these situations exist. They do. The question is whether we'll recognize them in time and whether we'll have the courage to act when we do.